Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 120 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. And yes, once again, you will need your listener passports, my friends, as we are going international once again in this episode. Back to one of my favorite destinations when seeking out subject matter experts. Land of the Rose, a Commonwealth of Nations, Britannia, the United Kingdom. Yes, we're going back to England this week. I am so very excited to introduce you all to a new connection of mine, and I am confident that this is not the last time we will be hearing from her. Professor Jo Clarke is a consultant and chartered psychologist and associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. Professor Clarke is the founder and director of Petros, a not-for-profit company dedicated to the development of resilience for life for individuals and organizations, children, and families. Now, Professor Clarke has extensive experience working in a diverse public sector organization, as well as a range of private and charitable companies as a clinician, trainer, consultant, and researcher. In recognition of the multiple and complex challenges facing staff in critical occupations, Professor Clarke has applied the results of several years of research to the development of comprehensive training packages and strategies designed to support both individuals and organizations in achieving their goals in good psychological health. As an associate of the Work Skills Center, Professor Clarke holds the European license for the delivery of the Challenge of Change. This is an evidence-based training that builds resilience through developing and enhancing mindfulness-related skills. Please sit back and enjoy my conversation with Professor Jo Clarke, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Clarke. Why don't we start off by you telling us a little bit about yourself, generally speaking, maybe some of your educational and professional milestones.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm Jo Clarke. I live in York in the UK, and I was practicing for about 20 years as a forensic psychologist in the UK prison service. But I didn't start out there. I didn't know that I was going to end up going to university as a young woman, and I got the opportunity to go at the last minute, and psychology just happened to be one of the subjects that I applied for, and the university I happened to get into was a human psychology degree. So I did a 4-year course with a year out in industry and came out the other end and didn't have a clue what I wanted to do, and applied for all sorts of jobs, including a PhD in equine behaviour, because I had a horse and had always loved riding as a kid. I also applied for a PhD at the University of Southampton, looking at the sexual behaviour of young people in light of the AIDS threat. So that gives you an idea of the period of time we were talking about, the 1980s. There was a job advertising a role in the prison service for a prison service psychologist. I was 23 and I thought, I'm too young to work in a prison. That sounds really scary. But I did apply for a job working for the Probation service, and that was the job that I got as a community service officer, supervising offenders in the community. And about 18 months into that role, having found that I loved working with offenders, thought that maybe I was about ready to apply for prison. So I wrote and said, are you still recruiting? And they said, yep. So I applied. I got through the process of getting a job as a trainee psychologist. And they offered me a job on the Isle of Wight, which is a tiny little island at the very south bit of the UK, at a prison called Albany, and they said Albany is going to become a centre of excellence in the treatment of sex offenders. I don't know how they predicted that, but that was how they tried to sell it to me. So would you go there? And I said, I don't want to work with sex offenders. I'm too young to work with sex offenders. I'm only 25. But anyway, I ended up there. I succumbed to the pressure to work with sex offenders, found I loved it. Much to my surprise, it was a very challenging, unique area to work in with offenders, and consequently got involved not just in the delivery of treatment but in training others in supervision. Spent 3 years there, but was still very interested always in the potential for this kind of work to do your head in. I still was thinking, how am I going to know if I'm okay doing this job? So at sort of the mid-90s, I moved to a prison in London, and we set up a unit for life sentence prisoners who were coming up to release, but given everything we'd learned over the previous 4 or 5 years about sexual offending, were considered now to be slightly more risky than they had been, because people were looking at their files and saying, actually, he may have been convicted for murder, but it looks like there's a sexual element to the offending. We need to reassess this individual. So the unit that I then managed was responsible for the assessment and potential treatment of these men who had never before been considered as under that title of sex offender. You can imagine how resistant they were. So it was a very, very challenging career period, but an extraordinary one. And what a privilege to have been involved. But, and this is something that really secured my interest in the well-being of staff, because around that time, 2 of my colleagues who I had worked alongside on the Isle of Wight, although not directly with, took the prison service to court for psychiatric injury. And they were both diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, it takes a long time for something to reach into the legal system. And I don't think their cases came up in about the year 2000. It didn't actually get to court because the prison service settled. But in that 5-year period, it made me think I really need to understand more. So actually in the year 2000, I went to the University of York to do a PhD. And I spent 3.5 years really trying to do a deep dive into why we get impacted by the work that we do. Because if it was just the nature of the job, if it was just working with sex offenders, we all would have been very damaged by it. There had to be other things at play. So I finished that degree, found out an extraordinary amount, which I suspect we'll chat about because it's relevant to all sorts of areas of work. And I went back into the prison service and got an opportunity to apply all those findings in high security prisons, which is what I did for the next 3 or 4 years. And then I got an opportunity to go back into academia, running a master's degree in forensic psychology. And that involved a period of research in Europe that was funded by the EU and run by the State Probation Service of Latvia. And it was called the SPORE Project. So it's possible that some people listening to this might know the SPORE Project, Sustaining Probation Officer Resilience in Europe. And I was their lead researcher on that project for 1.5 years that involved Latvia, Estonia, Bulgaria and the Netherlands. And it produced some fascinating results, which I know the Latvian service have been putting to very good use ever since. And I believe the other countries that were involved, although I haven't kept in touch with it. But then, having spent another 8 years in academia, I got the opportunity to set up my own business, and that's what I do now. So I run a small not-for-profit business called Petros. I've moved out of criminal justice to a large degree to apply the research findings to all areas of work, but I still do retain a very soft spot for criminal justice, and I'm fortunate enough to still do some work in criminal justice settings as well. So that's a bit whistle-stop, but I hope it explains everything that's happened.
It did. Thank you so much. So you mentioned your PhD. Let's go there. Your PhD focused on the psychological impact on facilitators of working therapeutically with sex offenders.
Yes.
I supervised sex offenders years ago in the past, and I contend that that particular population is arguably the most misunderstood of all of our justice-involved clients. Any additional reflections on your research and or advice you would give to practitioners working with that population? I know you referenced before some folks came out of this, I don't want to say unscathed, but not suffering from the same degree of PTSD. So what did your insights show in that area?
Well, unsurprisingly, it's complicated. It isn't nearly as straightforward as we think. But what fascinates me still, here we are in 2022, when I started doing a literature search in the year 2000, all but one research paper focused on the negative consequences of working therapeutically with sex offenders. And that was the same, I think, across offending generally. We seem to have an obsession of looking at the negative, which is horrifying. There was one paper that looked at the rewards of working with sex offenders by a Canadian woman called Michaela Kadambi and her supervisor, Derek Truscott. And there are so many rewards of the job, but we just focused on the costs. So that was kind of my starting point, really, is what are the factors that help us maximise the benefits of the work and minimise the negative outcome for people? And basically what I found is, as I mentioned before, if it was just the content of the work, which is what people think it is, if you work with sex offenders, you're bound to be damaged by it. If it was just that, we'd all be damaged. And we're not all damaged by it. But what the research indicated is there's basically an interplay with three groups of factors. One is the organisation and the nature of the work that you do. So let's say we've got this organisation box, if you like. Not that I like putting things in boxes, but that includes things like the content of the work, but the workload, the organisational culture, the hours worked, work-life balance, the physical work environment you're in. These are all really important factors, but it's not just them on their own, because there's also a set of features that we bring ourselves to the work as individuals. So who am I as a person? What do I bring? My history, my training, my abilities and disabilities, my living circumstances, my parental status, and then all the sorts of stuff about my personality, my problem-solving ability, my emotional expression, my emotional regulation, impulse control. Doesn't this sound familiar? All those sorts of factors that I bring with me into this organisational environment. And then there's basically what we call life. We call them dynamic factors. So things that change rapidly, maybe are unpredictable, maybe out with our control. A really obvious one, and this is going to sound so strange, but it's so important, is the weather, the time of year. You know, there's a thing called seasonal affective disorder that people get in winter. So imagine that you're going in to do some really difficult work in a really horrible environment, which mostly prisons are, that you may be a bit prone to anxiety. You've got a history in your past, perhaps, of your own difficulties as a child, and then you're going into the work in the middle of winter, all feels a bit rubbish and may leave you feeling a little bit more vulnerable. But then, of course, because we don't want to just focus on the negative, let's say you've got really good family support, you haven't got any major challenges in your world outside of work, everything's going well, you're very good at setting boundaries, you're a good problem solver, you balance your empathy with a kind of detached compassion, then there's a likelihood you're going to thrive. You know, so we can mix these things together. And one of the things that's just sort of come to my mind is I remember when I was working with sex offenders over that sort of 10 or so years I was doing that, I didn't get through that unscathed. There were times when I felt really vulnerable. And interestingly, they were times when, two particular times, one when a friend met a new partner and her partner wanted to bath with her children. And it absolutely sent shivers down my spine. And I remember feeling very vulnerable around that period of time. Another time when a colleague's son got convicted of abusing his own children. And then a little bit later when I wasn't actually working with sex offenders, but I was a fairly new mum. My daughter was 2. I'd moved to a new area to do my PhD. I was doing some work in a prison without any supervision. I'd go in for a day, supervised psychopathy assessments, come home to my 2-year-old, and I spent weeks actually feeling incredibly vulnerable, despite the fact I think I've got all sorts of skills around resilience and, problem solving and emotion expression. I've got a great support system. So there are definitely periods in my life, and I think this is the same for everyone, where you feel more vulnerable than you do at other times. And that's often those dynamic factors, those things that happen.
That is fascinating. When you mentioned those three variables, if you will, my mind really started thinking about the one which you mentioned, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's essentially, well, what is that staff member bringing to the table with them? And it just got me thinking, Professor Clarke, have you done any work around or advice as far as the role of the hiring manager when they're interviewing for these positions? And again, teasing out that within the applicants, for example, are they hiring those sort of old school trail them, nail them, and jail them? We love rhyming here in the United States in corrections.
Yeah.
Or are they hiring that person to, again, supervise sex offenders who are bringing that mindset and that attitude of, no, I believe in the absolute worth of everybody, and I believe in everybody's ability to change? How much, again, are the hiring managers hamstringing themselves by looking for the wrong things when they hire someone, which, after listening to you, it's more about a premeditation approach or what have you to the resiliency stuff down the road? Who's really best equipped or has the capacity for that?
Well, I think it's such an important question. And I remember concluding in the end that I don't know that we should necessarily hire for the specific characteristics that would characterise resilience. I think we should still hire for the skills to do the job. But I also think we need an awareness of any particular personality characteristics, habits, traits that might make people more vulnerable to stressful responding. Because there's no doubt what that kind of work in criminal justice does is present you with a set of very, very challenging circumstances in difficult environments with resistant clients often, or scared clients or dangerous clients. So if we know that somebody might have some vulnerabilities, or an alternative is going through a difficult time outside of work, maybe their child's ill or their parent needs care or their partner's facing redundancy. When we know these things, it can really help support that individual. So we had some cracking staff working with men convicted of sexual offences. They were phenomenally compassionate, sensitive and kind. And those characteristics could make them vulnerable to risk of burnout, risk of struggling, risk potentially, I guess, of post-traumatic stress. So it becomes really important to make sure we provide the right support for those people in order that they can exercise their skills to do the brilliant job that they do. So I don't think it's a question of selecting people out for lack of markers of resilience. I think we should still select people for the skills, but train them, support them properly, provide the right supervision, make sure they don't overwork.
Right. And it sounds like that should be an approach with the entire agency,
Yes.
all of those individuals working with damaged folks and not just those working with sex offenders.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you share with our listeners some highlights of your work? You mentioned you were employed as a forensic psychologist for Her Majesty's Prison Service. Mm-hmm. What did a typical day look like, Professor Clarke, if there was such a thing back then?
I don't think I've been racking my brains about a typical day at work, and I don't think there was one. At Brixton, when I was working there at the London prison, we obviously were setting up a new unit, so a lot of time was spent training staff, and we tried to be very revolutionary in the way we trained prison officers then, because we wanted very much a multidisciplinary team. So we'd be training people, we'd be assessing offenders, we'd be running treatment programs, I'd be supervising staff, planning the next program, sorting out audits and inspections, attending senior management team meetings. I mean, honestly, no half an hour was the same, let alone 2 days. So they're incredibly varied and brilliant. I loved it.
So we've been talking about these topics of resilience thus far, but I want to fast forward a little bit. And you've mentioned your work with Petros, which you became managing director in 2013. Yeah. In my work around the topic of desistance from crime, which we love talking about on this podcast, I have thrown myself into anything related to building resilience. And I know that factors into your work as well. Where do you see, again, the role of resilience in desistance from crime and or other areas of everyone's life, really?
Well, I think I'd like to answer that question by going back in time a little bit, actually, to how Petros came about. So I'd been working in criminal justice for a long time by then, maybe nearly 25 years. In 1998, I had my daughter, and circumstances such as they were, ended up as a single mum. From the ages of about 3 to maybe 8 years old, she presented me with some extraordinary challenges. So she used to have these like massive tantrums, but for no obvious reason. It wasn't because I'd said no or she wasn't getting her own way. It'd be usually, I know now, looking back, at the point of transition. So she'd be doing something, playing with something, and I'd say, come on, we've got to get in the car and go to the dentist. So it felt like a nuclear bomb had gone off. I think she was about 8 when I was at a conference in Dublin, and I was stood by the bookstall, and I came across, there was a book called The Explosive Child. And I picked it up, nothing to do with work at all. I was there for work, but nothing to do with work. I picked it up, read the first page, and it was almost like the author, a chap called Ross Green, and that's Green with an E, if anyone's interested, had been observing me with my child. And finally, I felt like somebody got what I was going through, because I knew she wasn't autistic. I didn't want to look for a diagnosis. I'd gone through all the things it could be, and I couldn't figure it out. And here's this man describing my daughter. Now, Ross is the pioneer of an approach called collaborative proactive solutions. And essentially his philosophy, and I think this is so relevant to offending, is that kids do well if they can, not kids do well if they want to. So if we start with the philosophy kids do well if they want to, we assume that when they're not doing well, it's because they don't want to, so we try and motivate them by rewarding them or punishing them, the classic behaviourism. However, if you come from this perspective that kids do well if they want to, kids do well if they can, then when they're not doing well, your perspective, your lens changes completely to try and understand what's getting in the way of them doing well. And you've got to ask yourself the question, and I ask lots of people this on training, do you want to do your best? And I have never come across a person who says no, I don't want to. They might say, I do, but I can't because I don't know how to. So I read Ross's book from front to back, and basically what he said is that kids who are challenging lack some core executive function skills such as problem solving, emotional regulation, impulse control, perspective taking, empathy, social awareness. And I'm sat there thinking, why is it that we're putting offenders through thinking skills and cognitive skills programs on their third sentence when actually these kids were probably identifiable at age 5, such as my daughter, potentially? I mean, I did imagine she'd end up in a high-security prison. I'll tell you how she's doing in a minute. She's not in a high-security prison. Why are we waiting? If we know these are the skills, and interestingly, these are the skills of resilience. And it was, I loved his work so much. I went out and trained to become a certified practitioner. And when I came back from the training, I just said to a friend of mine, I've got this idea for a business that brings together this work with children and my work on resilience, and look at how we can train and support people to build the skills they need. Resilience, for me, there are elements of it that are traits. I think, we know from research that about a third of people are born naturally resilient. They seem to develop these executive function skills without too much trouble. But the rest of us, we have to learn them, but they're trainable and we can pick them up early. And that was really how Petros was born. And now I've said all that, I can't remember what your original question was.
It had to do with resiliency, which you answered.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your response that term executive function. I consider myself a lifelong learner. I'm in the midst of securing another graduate certificate in trauma, resiliency, and self-care strategies. But when I started learning all about the role of executive function, and you referenced this as well, I'm a huge risk, need, responsivity champion. And as you know, a lot of that has to do with the utilization of cognitive behavioral interventions. But to your point, being blind, if you will, to the critical role of executive function, we're sometimes recommending and enforcing these conditions with no idea, again, as you referenced, to those important elements like executive function, for example. So yeah, I just am all about taking a holistic approach to the clients we served and not pigeonholing them as, well, you're a justice-involved individual or an offender, as some folks refer to them, and these interventions will work for you. You're different. These are interventions that, as you noted, you found valuable for your child. They're these universal themes, and I think the more we realize that, the more it behooves us as a profession. I mentioned my work in risk, need, responsivity world. I'm a huge assessment guy. Can you please share with our audience your recent project around your ADA, the Assessment of Dynamic Adaption?
Well, thank you for giving me a platform to talk about that, because I'm so excited about it. So essentially, when I was describing earlier about what came out of the PhD research about these categories of sort of individual, the organisation and life going on around us, and the way those three areas interact to help us understand whether we're more likely to thrive or barely survive, we put that together in what's called the model of dynamic adaptation. So it's described as dynamic adaptation because we are all constantly striving to adapt to our circumstances and the world around us. And therefore, our psychological well-being is in a constant state of flux. It's not stable, it's dynamic. We're constantly adjusting to what's going on around us. So the model has been around since the PhD, and it's been the basis for lots of our work at Petros and also my work in the prison service. And I have been itching for years to develop an assessment that runs alongside the model. So we know that there are factors that predict thriving organisationally and individually. And what this assessment does is assess 14 of those characteristics. There are probably more. We can't, if we assessed everything, it would just become an absolute mess. So we assess 7 individual sort of personal characteristics, things like diligence, things like optimism, things like emotional expression, emotional objectivity. And we assess the assessment assesses 7 organisational characteristics, for example, work-life balance, organisational culture, environment, team support, manager support. And from the development of the psychometric, which I've undertaken with a consummate psychometrician, she's absolutely amazing, called Jenny, she and I, between us, have tested these characteristics and know that they are predictive of thriving, of intention to stay in your job, and of job satisfaction. So if organisations were so inclined, they could assess the whole organisation. They would get a summary report of the scores, and it would give them an idea about where they can intervene, because the purpose, the model of dynamic adaptation gives you opportunity to think about where you put your resources to help people thrive. And what's rather unfortunate, I think, is most organisations have plenty in place once people have become unwell. And as my PhD supervisor said to me, that's rather like putting an ambulance at the bottom of a cliff that people throw themselves off. No, it's absolutely too little, too late. And what's really interesting, in physical health and safety terms, we wouldn't tolerate waiting until someone was injured, would we? If you worked in a factory on a conveyor belt, people were chopping their fingers off, we wouldn't have a first aider sat at the end sewing their fingers back on and sending them back. We'd be saying, why are people chopping their fingers off? This is terrible. We need to look at how we're recruiting, how we're training, how we're supervising. Is the equipment properly maintained? Are people working too long shifts? Are they taking regular breaks? And yet, with our psychological well-being, we wait until people get ill and then go, oh, here, have some therapy. We need to go right back upstream and say, how are we recruiting, training, supervising, supporting? How are we doing all these things to help people thrive at work? So that's what the assessment helps us identify. And I'm so thrilled with it. We've just done a big trial. If we've just got to iron out any minor glitches, and at the moment there don't appear to be any, but give me another week, and then it will be available for use. So,
well, that was my next question. Is this available for use for agencies or organizations with the courage to step up and take a look at themselves?
Yeah. And what the reports provide you, yes, I mean, absolutely, it will be commercially available. We don't want to charge a fortune for it, obviously, because we don't want for it to not be accessible. But what comes with it is a full report with lots of recommendations for intervention. And lots of those interventions, are free or cheap. They don't cost any money. There are some really simple things that organisations can do to help their staff thrive that really don't cost anything except attention and time.
What I will do, Professor Clarke, is leave information, whether that's a direct link or your contact information for any organizations or listeners who may want to take you up on that offer and
That'd be lovely. Thank
look at
you.
your assessment of dynamic adaptation. Say, I know we will be meeting face-to-face very soon in Barcelona when we converge as trainers for Professor Dernescu's second annual International Training School on Core Correctional Skills. And I know we've been talking about resiliency, but it's a great and important topic to talk about. Give our listeners sort of an abstract version of what the students have in store for them if they opt to join us in Barcelona.
Well, they'll probably get a chance to complete the assessment as part of their involvement, which would be great. But really, I mean, my aim is to help the students there understand that they're in what's called a critical occupation. I'm not sure if this is a term that's familiar with lots of people. It was coined initially by Douglas Patton and John Violante, who are working in the emergency services area. So Douglas Patton is a professor at Tasmania University. John Violante is in New York. I believe he was at John Jay. I'm not sure if he's still there. They've been researching for years the impact of being in policing, in disaster rescue, and so on. And they coined this term a critical occupation. And it refers to an occupation that exposes people to traumatic events and circumstances that may, and this is the really important bit, under certain circumstances, exert critical pressure on their psychological well-being. So what we're going to look at the school are those certain circumstances and look at how we can manage those, look at how we can assess vulnerability, assess areas of resilience, and look at how we can promote thriving in a critical occupation.
Well, I mentioned earlier I'm a lifelong learner, and as was the case last year when I appeared as a trainer, I plan on sticking around all week and being a student when I'm not facilitating to learn from the likes of you and the other great guests over there, including Professor Dernescu, Fergus McNeil, Juliana Carbonero, you and myself, of course. So looking forward to that. What is on the horizon for Professor Joe Clarke? If you look into your crystal ball and let's say when I have you back on the show in 3 years, let's say, what do you think we might be talking about down the road?
Well, I hope that we have developed more interventions based on the evidence that the assessment provides to support staff in the jobs that they're in. On a more personal level, I recently, in the last 6 months, joined the Majestys in the UK as a family court magistrate. So I hope to be doing more of that to look at how we protect children, make sure they're kept safe. I don't know if I don't think it's there in my in my bio, but I'm a foster mum. So I have a foster daughter who's finishing her nursing degree, so getting her through that. So it's pretty varied, really. I do have obviously a focus on work, and I absolutely, luckily for me, love what I do. I find I'm quite a nice boss. It's quite nice working for yourself. I don't have any of the bureaucracy that goes on in a public sector organisation. But, really developing, on a serious note, really developing elements of the business that organisations can tap into and target to ensure they do the best for the people that they employ.
You've got a great product there, and I most definitely see a need for it with the various agencies that I come across. Professor Jo Clarke, Petros, Resilience for Life. I will leave contact information in the show notes for folks to reach out to you, or they can reach out to me directly via the show's email address as well. Professor Clarke, it was great seeing you, and I look forward until next time.
Oh, thank you again for the invitation. It's been a delight.
All right, we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
A huge Criminologist podcast thank you to Professor Jo Clarke. I have left links, as promised, for some relevant information in the show notes of this episode. First and foremost, I'm leaving you the link for Professor Clarke's agency, Petros, Resilience for Life. You can check that out, which also features some upcoming courses and other great information related to all the good stuff Professor Clarke talked about today. She also referenced the report that she authored entitled Sustaining Probation Officer Resilience in Europe, or SPORE, S-P-O-R-E, a transnational study by Professor Jo Clarke. I've left a link to that PDF in the episode description as well. You also heard us reference the upcoming International Training School on Core Correctional Skills. That is right around the corner, October 3rd of 2022. Seats are still available, but I must caution you, we are capping this event at 24 students. We really want to have an enriching learning environment, so we're limiting the seats. However, seats are still available. I'm leaving you a link reflective of registration details in the episode description as well. Check that out. It will be myself, Jo Clarke, among others. This is a great event organized by the brilliant Professor Ioan Dernescu from the University of Bucharest, along with our friends at the Confederation for European Probation and the Center for Legal Studies in Barcelona. Finally, if you're a fan of the program and you wish to show your support financially, click on the Become a Supporter link for details of how you can, again, help show your support for the show for as little as just a few dollars a month. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me or Professor Jo Clarke on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Merchandise is available. Reach out if you'd like to be seen around the office sporting a Criminologist coffee mug or Criminologist ballpoint pen, or one of our famous Criminologist refrigerator magnets. And if you believe in what we're doing on the program, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, There's no them, there's only us.
Resilience for me, there are elements of it that are traits. I think, we know from research that about a third of people are born naturally resilient. They seem to develop these executive function skills without too much trouble. But the rest of us, we have to learn them, but they're trainable and we can pick them up early. And that was really how Petros was born. And now I've said all that, I can't remember what your original question was.
Inconceivable!
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.